welcome back to Harlem Liberation School on YouTube. Today, we're diving into the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. This was a time of incredible change and struggle for African Americans in the United States. You often hear about its successes, but today, we're going to look at both the positives and some of the criticism. To understand the civil rights movement, we need to start with Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation was legal in the United States as long as the separate facilities for black and white people were quote-unquote equal. This ruling established the doctrine of separate but equal and essentially legalized racial segregation in all public facilities, including schools, transportation, and restaurants. It gave legal cover to the Jim Crow laws that were designed to keep black people as second-class citizens. The civil rights movement was successful partly because of key organizations. For example, the NAACP, or National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, played a critical role in challenging segregation through the courts. Their legal team, led by Thurgood Marshall, argued many landmark cases, including Brown versus Board of Education, by using the 14th Amendment to demonstrate that segregation inherently denied African Americans equal protection under the law. Another important group of the civil rights movement was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC. Led by Dr. Martin Luther King, the SCLC focused on nonviolent protests and civil disobedience, drawing attention to the moral and legal contradictions of segregation. Then you had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. Known for grassroots activism, SNCC played a major role in organizing sit-ins and freedom rides, which challenged segregation in public spaces. SNCC also produced some major figures of the Black Power movement that would come later, including people like H. Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael, who later became Kwame Ture. Then you had the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. CORE was instrumental in organizing direct action campaigns, such as the Freedom Rides of 1961, which tested the Supreme Court ruling which banned segregation on interstate travel. CORE's efforts helped expose the violent resistance to desegregation in the South and drew national attention to the civil rights struggle. Let's now turn to some major compliments of the movement. Number one, we could look at its legal and legislative victories. The civil rights movement achieved monumental legal victories, starting with the Brown versus Board decision in 1954, which struck down the separate but equal doctrine in public education. The ruling was based on the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, as the NAACP argued effectively that segregated schools prize black children. Following this, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, prohibiting discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and ending segregation in public places. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 eliminated many of the barriers that prevented African Americans from voting. These legislative victories were direct responses to the movement's relentless activism and used the 14th Amendment to argue for equal treatment under the law. Another key complement of the civil rights movement was its mass mobilization and unity. The movement successfully mobilized a diverse coalition of people, blacks, white allies, religious leaders, and students, to challenge racial injustice. Events like the Montgomery bus boycott and the March on Washington in 1963 demonstrated the power of mass mobilization. The boycott lasted over a year and ended when the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional, a decision grounded, like so many of the others, in the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. The third major complement of the civil rights movement was its nonviolent resistance and its moral high ground. Leaders like Dr. King promoted nonviolent direct action protests, which was a brilliant strategy that exposed the brutality of white segregationists. Peaceful protests, such as the sit-ins, freedom rides, and marches, highlighted the injustice of segregation and helped to gain widespread public support. These nonviolent actions directly challenged the legality of segregation under the 14th Amendment, as they demonstrated that separate was not and could never really be equal. However, while nonviolence was effective in gaining public sympathy, some activists felt it was insufficient for achieving true liberation. This led to the rise of more militant voices, who criticized nonviolent resistance as too passive in the face of state-sanctioned violence. This leads us now to 3 critiques of the civil rights movement. The first would be its focus on legal equality over economic justice. One major critique was that the movement focused too heavily on legal rights and integration while neglecting economic issues. Activists like Malcolm X later would argue that gaining the right to sit in the same restaurant as white people didn't mean much if black people couldn't afford to eat there. They believed that economic empowerment and self-sufficiency were critical for true black liberation. A second major critique of the civil rights movement would be its overemphasis on integration. Critics like Malcolm X and later Stokely Carmichael argued that the goal of integrating black people into white society was misplaced. Instead of fighting for a seat at the table, they believed black people should have been fighting for self-determination and independent nationhood. They pointed to the long history of black self-reliance and argued that efforts should focus on building autonomous black communities and institutions. This critique gained traction as some desegregated schools and neighborhoods saw black students and residents being marginalized in integrated settings. The promise of integration did not necessarily lead to equality, and many black communities were left grappling with continued economic and social disparities. A key critique of the civil rights movement would be its limited impact on systemic racism. While the civil rights movement dismantled legal segregation, it did not dismantle systemic racism. Issues like police brutality, economic inequality, and educational disparities persisted. For instance, in the 1970s and beyond, many black communities continued to experience high levels of unemployment, substandard housing, and inadequate schooling. The movement's focus on changing laws did not necessarily change the hearts and minds of those enforcing them. The civil rights movement was a powerful force for change in the United States, successfully challenging the legal framework of segregation and discrimination established by the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case. It used the 14th Amendment to argue for equal treatment under the law and achieved significant victories. However, its focus on integration and legal rights, while necessary, was not sufficient to address deeper issues of economic inequality and systemic racism. What do you think? Were the movement's goals too narrow, or did it accomplish what it set out to do? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, stay informed and stay empowered.